The Ashworth Ball of 1818 would be remembered for many years hence, though not for the reasons its hosts had intended when they threw open the doors of their Mayfair mansion to London's glittering elite. Candlelight danced from 1,000 crystal prisms suspended from the vaulted ceiling, casting shadows that flickered and swayed in rhythm with the orchestra's lilting waltz, and the air hung heavy with the mingled scents of hothouse roses, expensive French perfumes, and the distinctive musk of ambition that always accompanied gatherings of the fashionable set. Lady Eleanor Hartley stood at the periphery of the ballroom, her gloved hands clasped before her as she observed the swirling kaleidoscope of silk and jewels, with the careful attention of one who knows herself to be present, but not quite belonging, a guest tolerated rather than celebrated. Her gown, a modest confection of pale blue muslin that her mother had painstakingly refreshed from 2 seasons prior, felt suddenly shabby beneath the chandelier's unforgiving light, though Eleanor told herself firmly that such thoughts were unworthy and revealed a vanity she had no right to possess. She was the daughter of Sir William Hartley, a baronet whose title was respectable enough, but whose coffers had long since run dry, leaving his family to navigate the treacherous waters of society with dignity as their only currency and careful economy as their constant companion. Eleanor had accepted the invitation to tonight's ball with a mixture of hope and trepidation, knowing that at 23 she was approaching the age when society would cease to consider her a prospect and begin to dismiss her as a remnant, yet unable to entirely extinguish the small flame of possibility that perhaps, somehow, this night might alter the trajectory of her modest existence. And then she saw him, Julian Ashworth, the Earl of Blackstone, standing across the ballroom like a figure conjured from the romantic novels Eleanor secretly devoured in the quiet hours of the afternoon, when her mother believed her to be practicing her needlework. He was everything the gossips claimed and more tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that caught the light and features carved with an almost cruel perfection, dressed in black evening clothes that proclaimed both his wealth and his studied indifference to those who might seek to impress him. Eleanor had heard the whispers, of course, the breathless speculation that accompanied the Earl wherever he ventured. 30,000 a year, at the very least, estates in 3 counties, a townhouse in Grosvenor Square, and a temperament as cold and unyielding as winter frost. He moved through the crowd with the easy arrogance of one who had never questioned his place at the apex of society's pyramid, and Eleanor felt her heart perform a traitorous flutter even as her mind counselled caution. She should not allow herself to notice him, should not permit even the shadow of hope to take root, for such foolishness led only to disappointment and pain. Yet as she watched him accept a glass of champagne from a passing footman and survey the assembled company with an expression of barely concealed boredom, Eleanor felt the weight of her own invisibility settle upon her shoulders like a familiar shawl, and she wondered, not for the first time, what it might feel like to be seen, truly seen, by someone who mattered in this glittering, merciless world. Eleanor's reverie shattered when she realized, with a jolt of disbelief that sent her pulse racing, that the Earl of Blackstone was moving directly toward her through the crowd, his dark eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat, and for one wild, impossible moment, she thought perhaps she had been mistaken, that surely he could not be approaching her, Eleanor Hartley of no particular consequence, when the room was filled with heiresses draped in diamonds and daughters of dukes who had been angling for his attention all season. Yet he came steadily closer, and Eleanor's hands trembled as she smoothed her modest skirts, acutely aware of every worn seam and outdated detail, even as a small, treacherous flame of hope kindled in her chest, despite all her better judgment and years of learning to expect nothing from a world that had so little to offer girls in her position. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, and he bowed with a grace that seemed almost mocking in its perfection. "Would you do me the honor of this dance?" The words hung in the air between them, and Eleanor felt the eyes of nearby guests turn toward them with curiosity and speculation, for the Earl of Blackstone did not dance with penniless baronets' daughters, did not notice girls who wore refreshed gowns and carried no dowry, and yet here he stood, his hand extended, waiting for her answer. Yes, my lord," Eleanor managed, her voice barely above a whisper, and she placed her gloved hand in his, feeling the strength of his grip as he led her onto the floor, where other couples swirled in elegant circles. the orchestra's waltz washing over them in waves of sound that seemed to promise magic and transformation. For several measures they danced in silence, and Eleanor allowed herself to believe, just for those few precious moments, that perhaps the world was not as cruel as she had learned it to be, that perhaps fairy tales sometimes touched the lives of ordinary girls, that perhaps she was not invisible after all, but seen, valued, chosen. Then Julian stopped, abruptly, in the very center of the ballroom where the light from the chandeliers burned brightest, and the eyes of society focused most keenly, and Eleanor felt her stomach drop as she saw something shift in his expression, a coldness descending like frost upon glass. "Tell me, Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying across the sudden hush that had fallen among the nearest couples, loud enough that heads turned and the whispers began immediately. "Did you truly believe that a girl in such an unfashionable gown, from a family in such diminished circumstances, would be a suitable partner for an earl?" The words struck her like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to wound, and Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as she stood frozen in his grip, unable to move or speak or even breathe. "Your dress is 2 seasons out of date at the very least," Julian continued, his tone almost conversational, as though he were discussing the weather rather than destroying another human being before an audience of London's elite. "And one can hardly help but wonder why someone in your position would presume to attend an event such as this, when surely you must know that charity has its limits, and pity can only stretch so far." The music continued, but the couples nearby had stopped dancing, their faces reflecting shock, fascination, horrified delight at witnessing such spectacular cruelty, and Eleanor felt something inside her shatter, all those carefully maintained defenses crumbling to reveal the raw, bleeding wound of her humiliation. She pulled her hand from his grasp, her vision blurring with tears she could not allow to fall in this place before these people, and without a word she turned and fled, her slippers carrying her through the crowd that parted before her, like a sea before a drowning woman, out of the ballroom, down the marble stairs, into the night, where the darkness could hide her shame, and the cool air could not ease the burning mortification that consumed her entirely. Eleanor sat in her modest bedroom in the narrow townhouse, her family rented in an unfashionable corner of Bloomsbury, still wearing the pale blue gown that now felt like a shroud of shame clinging to her skin, and she relived the moment again and again with the terrible clarity of fresh trauma, seeing Julian's face shift from false warmth to cold cruelty, hearing his words echo in the chambers of her mind, where they had carved themselves into permanent scars, feeling the weight of all those watching eyes that had witnessed her complete and utter destruction. She had not cried during the long carriage ride home, had not permitted herself to break even when her mother had found her sitting in the darkness and had wrapped gentle arms around her trembling shoulders. But now, alone in the hours before dawn when the world was silent and no one could hear her grief, Eleanor wept with a violence that shook her entire frame, mourning not just the humiliation, but the death of something fragile and precious she had carried within her heart. Her mother came to her at first light, bringing tea that Eleanor could not drink, and speaking soft words of comfort that could not penetrate the fortress of pain Eleanor had erected around herself, and Lady Hartley's face was lined with a sorrow that came from knowing her daughter had experienced a cruelty she could not undo, had been wounded in a way that would leave marks no surgeon could heal. By mid-morning, the rumors had already spread through London like plague through a crowded city, carried on the gleeful tongues of those who found entertainment in others' suffering, and the few invitations that had trickled toward the Hartley household ceased entirely, replaced by a silence more devastating than any spoken condemnation. Eleanor's younger sister, Catherine, barely 16 and still innocent of society's viciousness, found Eleanor in the small parlor that afternoon and asked with genuine confusion why several ladies had cut them in the park that morning. Why Mrs. Pemberton had turned away when Catherine had greeted her, and the innocent bewilderment in her sister's eyes pierced Eleanor's heart more deeply than any of Julian's calculated cruelties. She could bear her own humiliation, could survive her own pain, but the thought that her shame might taint her sister's prospects, might close doors that should have remained open to one so young and blameless, filled Eleanor with a despair so profound she felt she might drown in it. That evening, as London prepared for yet another round of balls and entertainments, from which the Hartleys were now permanently excluded, Eleanor made her decision with the grim certainty of one who has looked into the abyss and chosen survival over continued suffering. She would leave London, would retreat to Hartley Manor, the small country estate in Derbyshire that was all her father's reduced circumstances had left them, would turn her back on this glittering, merciless world that had shown her only cruelty in exchange for her tentative hope. She would bury her dreams of love and acceptance in the quiet earth of the countryside, would learn to find contentment in simplicity and solitude, and would become the spinster aunt who taught village children and tended roses, and lived a life so small and quiet that it could never again be shattered by cruel men with handsome faces and hearts of stone. And if sometimes in the darkness she grieved for the girl who had believed in fairy tales and the possibility of being chosen, she would learn to silence that grief as one learns to live with chronic pain, accepting it as the price of having been foolish enough to hope in a world that reserved its kindness for those born with fortune and crushed those who dared to reach beyond their station. 3 months had passed since Eleanor fled London's glittering cruelty, and she now stood in the kitchen garden of Hartley Manor with soil beneath her fingernails and the September sun warm upon her shoulders, tending the herbs that grew in neat rows along the stone wall, where generations of Hartley women had cultivated rosemary and thyme and lavender that filled the air with scents that spoke of home and healing rather than expensive perfumes, that masked the rot beneath society's elegant surface. The manor itself was modest, a grey stone structure with mullioned windows and ivy climbing its western face, set in the rolling hills of Derbyshire, where the landscape stretched in shades of green and gold, where sheep dotted the distant fields, and the village of Ashford lay nestled in the valley below with its ancient church and market square, and simple people who measured worth in kindness rather than quarterings and dowries. Eleanor had found, to her surprise, that she did not miss London's entertainments, did not long for balls and theatre, and the constant performance that society demanded. For here she could breathe without the constriction of stays laced too tight and expectations that crushed the spirit, and could walk for hours across the moors without encountering anyone who knew of her humiliation or whispered behind gloved hands about the girl who had been destroyed by the Earl of Blackstone's casual cruelty. She had taken to teaching at the village school 3 mornings each week, helping the rector's wife instruct children whose hands were rough from farm work, but whose minds were eager and bright, and she found more satisfaction in seeing a child master their letters than she had ever found in any drawing-room conversation about fashion and gossip and who would marry whom. The days had developed a rhythm that soothed her wounded heart, a pattern of simple tasks and quiet pleasures that gradually allowed the raw edges of her pain to begin scarring over, though she knew the wound would never fully heal, would always remain tender to the touch of memory. She rose with the sun and worked in the gardens, read in the afternoons from the modest library her grandfather had assembled, helped her mother with the household accounts and the preservation of fruits from their small orchard, walked the countryside until her legs ached and her mind grew quiet, and in the evenings she sat by the fire with needlework or a book while her mother played gentle melodies on the pianoforte that was their one remaining luxury. The changing seasons marked her gradual healing, summer giving way to autumn's golden light, and Eleanor began to believe that she had successfully left that other world behind forever, had built a new life from the ruins of her old dreams, a life that might lack romance and excitement, but offered something more valuable, a peace born of accepting her place and finding contentment in what she had, rather than mourning what she would never possess. Then, on a grey October afternoon, when the first frost had touched the gardens and the wind carried the scent of wood smoke from cottage chimneys, a letter arrived from her mother, who had remained in London to chaperone Catherine through her first season, and Eleanor's hands trembled as she broke the seal and read the words that shattered her carefully constructed tranquility, for her mother wrote that the Earl of Blackstone had been making inquiries about Eleanor's whereabouts, had asked after her at 3 separate gatherings, and had seemed genuinely distressed to learn she had left London entirely, and Lady Hartley wondered if perhaps Eleanor might consider returning for the winter season if the Earl intended to make amends for his unconscionable behaviour. Eleanor read the letter twice, feeling the old anger and humiliation rise in her chest like bile, and then she crossed to the fireplace where a small blaze burned against the autumn chill and held the paper to the flames, watching as her mother's careful script blackened and curled and turned to ash, destroying any possibility that Julian Ashworth's belated regret might reach across the miles to disturb the sanctuary she had built in this quiet corner of England, where earls and their cruelties could not touch her. Julian Ashworth sat in the library of his London townhouse 6 weeks after the ball, a half-empty bottle of brandy on the table beside him, and the curtains drawn against the afternoon sun that seemed too bright for the darkness that had settled into his soul. And he stared at the portrait of his father that hung above the mantelpiece, with eyes that burned from sleeplessness and shame, seeing in those painted features the same cold calculation that had driven him to destroy an innocent woman for the crime of making him feel something he had been taught to despise. His friend, Lord Marcus Weatherby, found him there in the gathering dusk and stopped in the doorway with an expression of disgust that Julian recognized as entirely deserved, for Marcus had witnessed the humiliation at the ball and had not spoken to Julian since that night, and the silence between them had been more damning than any words could have been. "You are a coward and a fool," Marcus said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a friendship that had spanned 2 decades and might not survive this moment. "And what you did to that girl was unconscionable. The act of a small man hiding his own weakness behind cruelty." Julian did not defend himself, could not find words to explain what he barely understood himself, and instead he poured another measure of brandy with hands that trembled slightly and drank it down like medicine that could not cure the sickness eating at his heart. The truth had come to him slowly, over these weeks of self-imposed isolation, emerging from beneath layers of pride and conditioning, like bones surfacing through eroding soil, and the revelation had been devastating in its simplicity. He had humiliated Eleanor Hartley because he had been genuinely attracted to her, and had felt his carefully constructed walls begin to crack when she smiled at him across the ballroom, had recognized in her something real and warm that terrified him more than any battlefield ever had. She was unsuitable, his father's voice echoed in his mind, a baronet's daughter with no fortune and no connections, exactly the sort of woman a sensible earl would bed in private, but never acknowledge in public, and Julian had internalized these lessons so thoroughly that when confronted with a woman who made him want to choose heart over duty, he had lashed out with the viciousness of a wounded animal defending itself against kindness. His father's deathbed words came back to him now with bitter clarity. The old earl's final instruction that Julian must marry for advantage and never let sentiment cloud his judgment, must remember that love was a luxury the nobility could not afford, and Julian had nodded and promised and locked away every tender impulse behind walls of ice that he had believed would protect him from the weakness that had destroyed lesser men. But those walls had not protected him, had instead made him into something monstrous, a man who would crush a gentle woman's spirit rather than admit he was capable of feeling anything beyond cold calculation, and the cost of that protection had been his own humanity. Marcus crossed the room and took the brandy bottle away, setting it beyond Julian's reach with the firmness of one who had earned the right to such interventions. "She has left London," Marcus said, watching Julian's face for reaction, "gone to her family's estate in Derbyshire, and by all accounts does not intend to return. And can you blame her when you destroyed her reputation and her confidence in front of half the ton?" Julian felt something crack inside him at these words, a final breaking of the facade he had maintained even to himself, and he understood with devastating clarity that he had not merely hurt Eleanor Hartley, but had driven away the one woman who had ever looked at him and seen something worth caring for beneath the title and the wealth and the practiced charm. He had spent weeks telling himself that his guilt was merely the natural response of a gentleman who had behaved badly, that it would fade with time and distance, but now he recognized it for what it truly was, the grief of having destroyed his own chance at something real because he had been too cowardly to reach for it. "I must find her," Julian said, the words emerging hoarse and raw, carrying the weight of a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown depths. "I must beg her forgiveness and somehow, though I deserve nothing, convince her that I am not the man she saw that night, or rather, that I need not remain that man if given the chance to become something better." Marcus studied him with eyes that had seen through Julian's pretenses since they were boys at Eton, and finally nodded slowly, perhaps recognizing that some transformations could only come through the painful work of making amends for past cruelties and earning back what one had carelessly destroyed. Julian arrived at Hartley Manor on a cold November morning, when frost clung to the bare branches, and his breath misted in the air, having ridden through the night from London, with a desperation that bordered on madness, and he stood before the modest stone house, with its weathered facade and simple gardens gone dormant for winter, understanding that he was about to face a reckoning he had no right to expect would end in anything but rejection. The elderly housekeeper who answered his knock took one look at his face and seemed to know immediately who he was, for her expression hardened into something between contempt and pity, and when he asked to see Lady Eleanor, she told him in clipped tones that her mistress was not receiving visitors, particularly not visitors who had travelled from London with dubious intentions. Julian left a letter at the door, his hand trembling as he placed the sealed paper on the stone step, knowing that the words he had laboured over for 3 days were inadequate to express the depth of his remorse, that no arrangement of sentences could undo what he had done or convey the transformation that had begun in his soul. But he had to try, had to offer something, even if it was rejected. Eleanor stood at her bedroom window and watched him walk away toward the village, her hands pressed against the cold glass, and when the housekeeper brought her the letter, she stared at it as though it were a serpent that might strike, feeling the old anger rise in her chest alongside something more complicated, a curiosity she despised herself for feeling. She read his words in the fading afternoon light, his confession of cowardice and cruelty, his acknowledgement that nothing he could say would excuse what he had done, his plea, not for forgiveness, but simply for the chance to prove through actions rather than words that he was capable of becoming a better man, and her hands shook with anger and residual pain as she carried the letter to the fireplace and watched the flames consume his carefully penned apologies, reducing them to ash that could not hurt her again. Julian took lodgings at the Hound and Hart, the village's only inn, a modest establishment with low beams and uneven floors that the innkeeper's wife kept scrupulously clean, and he began a campaign of attempted reconciliation that Eleanor met with absolute refusal, for when flowers arrived at Hartley Manor with notes attached, they were returned unopened, and when more letters came, Eleanor burned them without breaking the seals, and when she attended Sunday service at the ancient stone church and found Julian sitting in the back pew, she gathered her skirts and left immediately through the side door, her mother following with apologetic glances at the Earl, who knelt in prayer or shame, or some combination of both. The village began to gossip, of course, for how could they not, when an Earl had taken up residence at their humble inn and seemed to have no purpose except pursuing the baronet's daughter who wanted nothing to do with him, and the speculation ranged from romantic to scandalous to pitying, though most agreed that Lady Eleanor had every right to reject the advances of a man who had, by all accounts, treated her abominably in London. Eleanor's resolve hardened with each attempted contact, her determination not to be made a fool twice, becoming an armor she wore against the tiny voice in her heart that wondered what it meant that he had come so far and stayed so persistently, for she told herself that this was merely the whim of a wealthy man unused to being denied anything he desired, that his interest would fade once the novelty of rejection wore thin, that she would not allow his belated regret to disturb the peace she had worked so hard to build from the ruins of her shattered confidence. Weeks passed, and winter settled over Derbyshire with quiet determination, blanketing the countryside in frost and early darkness, and Julian remained at the Hound and Hart, though Eleanor had given him no encouragement whatsoever, no sign that her heart had softened even marginally toward the man who had destroyed her confidence and driven her from London society. But something in his approach had changed, for he no longer sent flowers or letters or attempted to force encounters at church, and instead he simply became a presence in the village, a man who rose early and worked alongside the farmers, repairing stone walls damaged by autumn storms, who donated generously to the village school so that the children might have proper books and slates, who spent long hours helping old Thomas the blacksmith with heavy work that had become too much for aging joints and failing strength. Eleanor observed these activities from a distance with suspicion hardening her heart against any interpretation that might suggest genuine transformation, for she told herself that this was merely performance and the calculated generosity of a wealthy man attempting to buy his way into her good graces by impressing the simple country folk who surrounded her. She watched from her bedroom window as he worked in the December cold, his fine coat discarded, and his shirt sleeves rolled up as he hauled timber for the widow Morrison's new fence, and she told herself that no Earl would truly debase himself with manual labor unless it served some ulterior purpose, unless he believed that these demonstrations of humility would somehow erase the cruelty he had inflicted upon her in that glittering ballroom a lifetime ago. One rainy afternoon in late December, when the sky hung low and grey, and the roads had turned to rivers of mud, Eleanor was returning from the village school where she had been teaching the youngest children their letters, and she came upon a scene that stopped her in the shelter of an ancient oak, hidden from view, but able to observe clearly what unfolded before her. Old Mrs. Weatherstone, who must have been 70 if she was a day, and whose stubbornness was legendary throughout the county, had attempted to bring her cart to market despite the worsening weather, and now the wheel had broken and spilled her carefully wrapped butter and cheese into the mud, and she stood there in the rain looking lost and frightened in a way that Eleanor had never seen from the formidable old woman. Julian appeared from the direction of the inn, his hair already plastered to his head by the downpour, and he did not hesitate or call for servants or stand at a distance, offering useless sympathy, but instead he knelt directly in the mud and began gathering the scattered goods, speaking to Mrs. Weatherstone in tones too low for Eleanor to hear, but gentle enough that the old woman's expression shifted from distress to something approaching relief. He worked for nearly half an hour in the cold rain, rigging a temporary repair to the wheel with rope and pieces of wood scavenged from a nearby fence, his fine clothes ruined beyond redemption and his hands bleeding from splinters. And never once did he glance around to see if anyone was watching. Never once did his manner suggest that he was performing for an audience or expecting gratitude or recognition for his assistance. Eleanor watched from her hidden vantage point and felt something crack in the armor she had built around her wounded heart, a tiny fissure that let in the possibility, terrifying and unwelcome, that perhaps people could truly change, that perhaps the man kneeling in the mud, helping an elderly woman salvage her livelihood, was not the same man who had publicly humiliated her for sport, and this realization frightened her more than continued hatred ever could, for hatred was safe and familiar, while the alternative required a vulnerability she was not certain she possessed anymore. 6 weeks after Julian's arrival in the village, Eleanor set out on her customary afternoon walk through the winter landscape, following the familiar path that wound past frost-covered fields and skeletal trees whose bare branches reached toward a sky heavy with the promise of snow, and she had gone perhaps a mile from Hartley Manor when the first drops began to fall. Not snow, as she had expected, but cold rain that quickly intensified into a downpour that soaked through her cloak within minutes and turned the path beneath her feet into treacherous mud. She quickened her pace toward home, but the storm strengthened with startling ferocity, the wind driving sheets of icy rain that stung her face and made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, and she was considering taking shelter beneath the inadequate canopy of an oak when she heard her name called through the tempest and turned to see Julian running toward her from the direction of the village, his coat already drenched and his hair plastered to his forehead. "There's a barn just ahead," he shouted over the roar of wind and rain, pointing toward a structure she could barely discern through the grey curtain of the storm. And though every instinct told her to refuse his assistance and continue alone, the rational part of her mind recognized that she would be soaked to the bone and possibly ill if she attempted to reach home in such weather. So she nodded once and allowed him to guide her toward the shelter without taking the arm he carefully did not presume to offer. The barn belonged to the Hendersons, she knew, and it smelled of hay and animals and dry wood as they stumbled inside, both of them dripping and shivering in the sudden silence that fell when Julian pulled the heavy door closed against the storm. He immediately removed his coat and held it out to her, but Eleanor shook her head with icy politeness, saying, "I am quite well, my lord," though her teeth chattered and her hands trembled from cold and from the terror of finding herself alone with him for the first time since that dreadful night in London. "You are soaked through," Julian said quietly, his voice holding none of the arrogance she remembered, only concern and a careful humility that somehow made her angrier than hauteur would have. "Please, Lady Eleanor, I know you despise me, and you have every right to do so, but do not let your justified hatred lead to illness out of pride." She took the coat with stiff fingers and wrapped it around her shoulders. Hating that it was warm from his body and that the warmth felt like mercy she did not wish to accept from him, and they stood in awkward silence, broken only by the drumming of rain on the barn roof and the occasional rumble of thunder that suggested the storm would not pass quickly. "I do not despise you," Eleanor heard herself say, the words emerging before she could stop them. formal and measured and utterly untrue. "I simply wish you would leave me in peace and return to whatever life you had in London before you developed this peculiar obsession with seeking absolution for sins that cannot be forgiven." Julian flinched as though she had struck him. And good, she thought, let him feel even a fraction of the pain he had caused her. But when he spoke, his voice remained steady and low and terrible in its sincerity. "I do not expect forgiveness," he said, standing at a careful distance that acknowledged her need for space. "I know that what I did was unforgivable, that I destroyed something precious for reasons that had nothing to do with you and everything to do with my own cowardice and fear. And I know that no apology, no matter how genuine, can undo the harm I caused or restore what I took from you that night." The rain continued its relentless assault on the barn, and Eleanor found herself trapped not just by weather, but by the intensity of his gaze, by words that stripped away the easy anger she had been nursing and forced her to confront the more complicated truth that part of her, a part she despised, wanted desperately to believe that transformation was possible and that people could change, that the man standing before her was not simply performing remorse, but genuinely understood the magnitude of his cruelty and the depth of her pain. Months later, when autumn arrived and painted the Derbyshire countryside in shades of amber and gold, Julian remained in the village, though Eleanor had given him no explicit encouragement beyond that single conversation in the barn during the storm, and something in the quality of their interactions had shifted in ways so subtle that Eleanor almost did not notice at first, for there were small moments now that accumulated like fallen leaves, a nod when she encountered him at the market where he was purchasing supplies to repair the village school's roof, a brief greeting exchanged after Sunday service when their paths crossed at the church gate and neither fled from the other's presence, and a moment when their eyes met across the village green, and he smiled with such careful gentleness that she found herself unable to sustain her icy composure and looked away, not in anger but in confusion at the warmth that threatened to bloom in her chest. Her younger sister Catherine arrived for a fortnight's visit in late September, full of London gossip and sisterly concern, and she observed Julian from a distance before pronouncing with characteristic directness that he seemed genuinely altered from the arrogant man who had destroyed Eleanor's reputation, that his work in the village appeared sincere rather than performative, and that perhaps Eleanor should consider the possibility that forgiveness might free her as much as it would absolve him. "You still love him," Catherine said one evening as they sat before the fire, her voice gentle but certain, "or perhaps you love the man he has become, which is not quite the same thing but might be better, for we cannot build futures on who people were but only on who they choose to be now." Eleanor denied it, of course, but the words haunted her in the days that followed, particularly one golden afternoon when she was walking past the village common and saw Julian with a group of children, teaching them to fly kites. He had evidently constructed himself, his coat discarded and his laughter genuine, as a little girl's kite soared higher than all the others, and she shrieked with delight. He looked up and saw Eleanor watching, and for a moment neither moved, and then the little girl tugged at his sleeve, demanding his attention, and he turned back to the children. But something in that brief exchange struck Eleanor with unexpected force, for she saw in that scene the ghost of dreams she had once harbored before that terrible night in London, dreams of family and children and a man who would be not just husband but partner, dreams, she had thought, crushed beyond revival, but which now stirred painfully in her heart, like spring flowers pushing through frozen ground. That night she lay awake in her bed at Hartley Manor and thought about the difficulty of opening a wounded heart, about how much easier it was to remain encased in protective ice than to risk the vulnerability of thawing, about whether she possessed the courage to believe that transformation was genuine and lasting rather than temporary performance, and she wondered whether she was protecting herself from further harm or simply punishing them both for sins that perhaps had been sufficiently atoned for through sustained action and patient devotion, and she found no answers in the darkness, but only questions that would not let her rest. The turning point arrived in mid-October when Mrs. Weatherby, Eleanor's elderly neighbour who lived alone in a cottage at the edge of the village, fell gravely ill with a fever that left her bedridden and delirious, and word spread quickly through the small community that the old woman had no family to care for her and that the village women were taking turns sitting with her through the long nights. Eleanor arrived at the cottage one grey afternoon with a basket of medicines and broth, prepared to take her turn at the sickbed, and she stopped in the doorway when she saw Julian already there, slumped in a chair beside Mrs. Weatherby's bed, with dark circles beneath his eyes, and his shirt sleeves rolled up, his coat discarded and his cravat loosened as though he had been there for many hours without rest, and in his hands he held a worn book from which he was reading aloud in a low, steady voice, though the old woman appeared to be sleeping. He looked up when Eleanor entered, and she saw exhaustion in every line of his face, but he simply nodded to her and continued reading until he reached the end of the chapter, then carefully marked the page and set the book aside before rising to greet her with the same careful formality he always maintained in her presence. "She has been asking for you," he said quietly, gesturing toward the sleeping woman. "The fever breaks and returns in cycles, and in her lucid moments she speaks of how kind you have been to her, how you bring her vegetables from your garden and read to her on Sunday afternoons." Eleanor moved to the bedside and placed her hand on Mrs. Weatherby's forehead, finding it still too warm but perhaps not as burning as it had been according to the reports she had heard, and she turned to Julian with a question in her eyes about how long he had been maintaining this vigil. 3 days, he admitted. "The doctor says the crisis should pass soon if we can keep her comfortable and make sure she takes liquid, and I thought perhaps I could be of some use here, since there is little else I can offer this village that has shown me such unexpected grace, despite knowing what I am and what I have done." They worked together through the prisative ISO afternoon and into the evening, Eleanor preparing poultices and spooning broth between the old woman's cracked lips, while Julian changed soiled linens and fetched water, and performed all the unglamorous tasks of sickroom nursing without complaint or hesitation. And there was something profoundly intimate about this quiet companionship, this shared purpose that required no words but only steady presence and gentle hands, and Eleanor found herself observing him with new eyes as he carefully lifted Mrs. Weatherby to help her drink, supporting her frail weight with a tenderness that seemed to come from some deep well of compassion she had not imagined he possessed. When the fever finally broke near midnight and the old woman fell into peaceful sleep, Eleanor felt tears of relief and exhaustion sting her eyes, and Julian saw them and handed her his handkerchief without comment, and she took it and pressed it to her face and allowed herself to feel the weight of the past months, the slow thawing of her frozen heart, the terrifying possibility that perhaps transformation was real and redemption was possible, and that the man standing beside her in this humble cottage was genuinely altered from the cruel aristocrat who had destroyed her in the glittering ballroom. "Thank you," she said when Mrs. Weatherby had been settled comfortably and they stepped outside into the cool autumn night, and they were the first words of genuine warmth she had spoken to him since that day in the barn, and she saw something shift in his expression, hope kindling like a fragile flame that he dared not acknowledge too openly for fear of extinguishing it. They walked together through the autumn woods toward Hartley Manor, not touching but moving in companionable silence, broken only by the rustle of fallen leaves beneath their feet, and when they reached the place where their paths would diverge, Julian spoke with careful deliberation about his own loneliness, about how that terrible night in London had become the defining moment of his life, not because of what he had done, but because of what it had revealed about the man he had been and the man he desperately wanted to become, about how every day in this village had been both penance and transformation, suffering and grace intertwined, and Eleanor listened with her heart slowly unfreezing, like ice yielding at last to the persistent warmth of spring. Winter approached with the first frost silvering the bare branches and meadows of Derbyshire, and in those shortened days Eleanor and Julian developed a cautious friendship that grew like careful stitches mending torn fabric, for their walks together became regular occurrences that the village noted with gentle approval rather than scandal, and they discussed books with the easy familiarity of kindred spirits, debating philosophy and poetry as they traversed familiar lanes now edged with ice, and Eleanor found herself sharing hopes she had thought buried forever, while Julian spoke of his own dreams with a vulnerability that seemed impossible from the arrogant Earl who had once measured all things by wealth and status. He never presumed anything beyond friendship, never reached for her hand or spoke words of romantic intention, and this restraint paradoxically drew her closer to him than any passionate declaration might have done, for she understood that he was allowing her to set every boundary and control every step of their progression, and there was profound respect in that patience. One snowy evening in late November, Eleanor's mother extended an invitation for Julian to dine at Hartley Manor, and he arrived bearing no extravagant gifts, but only a small book of pressed wildflowers he had collected throughout the autumn, each bloom carefully labelled with the date and location where he had found it, and Eleanor's mother observed them both throughout the meal, with eyes that saw what perhaps Eleanor herself was still reluctant to acknowledge. The way Julian's gaze followed her daughter with careful tenderness, the way Eleanor's laughter came more freely than it had in years, the subtle dance of two people finding their way back to wholeness through each other's presence. After dinner, they sat before the fire in the drawing-room, while Eleanor's mother retired with knowing grace, leaving them alone in the warm circle of firelight, and they talked late into the night as snow fell steadily beyond the frosted windows, and Julian spoke with raw honesty about the depth of his self-loathing in the months after that terrible ball, about how his father's deathbed insistence that an Earl must marry for advantage rather than affection had poisoned his thinking, about how he had destroyed the one person who had genuinely moved his heart because he had been too cowardly to defy expectations and too arrogant to recognize that true worth had nothing to do with fortune or consequence. Eleanor listened without interruption, watching the play of firelight across his face as he laid bare the darkest corners of his soul. And when he finished speaking, she found herself sharing her own pain in return, not just the humiliation of that night, but the deeper wound of having believed herself unworthy of love, of having internalized society's judgment that she was somehow less because her dowry was modest and her family's estate small. And she spoke of her gradual healing here in the country, of learning to value herself, not through others' eyes, but through her own recognition of her inherent worth. And Julian listened with such fierce attention that she felt truly seen, perhaps for the first time in her life, not as an ornament or a social inferior, but as a complete and valuable human being whose thoughts and feelings mattered profoundly. When the clock struck midnight and the fire had burned low to glowing embers, Julian rose to take his leave, and Eleanor walked with him to the door where fresh snow had drifted against the threshold, and he paused there in the cold hallway and said simply that knowing her, truly knowing her, had been the greatest privilege of his life, and she felt something shift irrevocably in her chest, the last defensive wall crumbling at last to reveal the truth. She had been protecting herself from acknowledging that she trusted him now in ways she had thought impossible, that transformation was real and sustained and worthy of belief. The Christmas season arrived with the village transformed into something from a pastoral painting, every cottage adorned with holly and ivy, and the small stone church, where Eleanor had found solace during her darkest days, now glowed with candlelight as the community gathered for the traditional celebration that marked the heart of winter, and Eleanor attended in a gown of deep green velvet that her mother had sent from London, simpler than the fashions she had once worn, but infinitely more suited to the woman she had become. And when Julian arrived and saw her standing near the altar arranging evergreen boughs, something passed across his face that made her breath catch, a look of such profound tenderness that she had to turn away to compose herself. They attended the celebration together, and though they maintained proper distance as always, the village noted their companionship with gentle speculation that Eleanor could feel like a warm current beneath the surface of every conversation, and she found she did not mind it as she once would have, for these people had shown her only kindness and had accepted Julian's presence among them with the generosity of those who understood that redemption was possible for any soul willing to pursue it with genuine intent. After the service, when mulled wine and sweet cakes were shared in the church hall and children ran laughing between the adults, Julian drew Eleanor aside into the quiet sanctuary of the empty church, where candles still flickered on the altar and the scent of pine and beeswax hung heavy in the cold air. And there in that sacred space he asked the question she had been both hoping for and dreading, whether she might ever forgive him fully, whether the shadow of that terrible night would always stand between them, whether she could imagine a future in which they might be more than the careful friends they had become. Eleanor stood in the circle of candlelight and felt the question penetrate to her very core, forcing her to confront the truth she had been avoiding for weeks now, and she recognized with painful clarity that she had already forgiven him, that the forgiveness had crept in gradually through accumulated evidence of his transformation, through his patience and humility and the countless small kindnesses he had shown, not just to her, but to everyone in this village who had given him the grace of their acceptance. But forgiveness and trust were different countries, separated by a vast and treacherous sea, and she did not know if she possessed the courage to make that crossing. "I have forgiven you," she said quietly, watching his expression shift from hope to something more complex. "But I do not know yet if I can trust you with my heart again, for you held it once before and you crushed it without hesitation, and though I believe you are changed, though I see the evidence of that change every day, there is still a part of me that remembers the pain and fears that perhaps this is all performance, that perhaps when tested you will revert to the man you were, and I will find myself destroyed once more." Julian listened without defensiveness, and when she finished he simply nodded and said that he understood, that he had no right to ask for more than she could give, that he would wait however long it required for her to feel safe enough to risk her heart again. And there was such genuine acceptance in his words that Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes, for she knew in that moment that a man who could hear her fear without trying to dismiss or minimize it, who could honor her boundaries without resentment, was a man fundamentally different from the one who had humiliated her in that ballroom. They returned to the celebration together, and the evening passed in warmth and community. And that night, when Eleanor lay in her bed watching moonlight silver the frost on her window, she acknowledged the truth that had been growing in her heart for months now, the terrifying and wonderful reality that she had fallen in love with the man Julian had become, that she loved his gentleness and his humor, and the way he listened as though her words were treasures, that she loved the patience he had shown, and the genuine remorse he carried not as performance, but as transformation. But alongside that love lived fear, the wounded animal part of her that remembered betrayal and could not quite believe that safety was possible. And she knew that before she could fully open her heart, she would need to find the courage to choose vulnerability again, despite every reasonable argument against it. Early spring arrived with tentative warmth that coaxed the first crocuses from the still cold earth, and it had been nearly a year since Julian first appeared in the village, seeking redemption, a year of gradual transformation that Eleanor could measure in accumulated moments of trust and understanding, and it was in this season of renewal that an unexpected letter arrived bearing the London postmark and the familiar handwriting of Lady Catherine Pemberton, one of the few friends who had not abandoned Eleanor after that terrible night, and the invitation was to a ball at the Pemberton residence, with a note expressing Catherine's hope that Eleanor might finally return to society, if only for a single evening among those who truly valued her. Eleanor's first instinct was to decline, as she had declined all such invitations over the past months, to remain safely in the country where her life had been rebuilt and her heart carefully protected, but something in Catherine's words stirred an old longing that she had thought buried forever, the desire not to hide from her past, but to confront it on her own terms. And when Julian learned of the invitation during one of their afternoon walks through the awakening countryside, he paused beside a hedge newly green with spring growth and spoke with careful gentleness about whether perhaps she might consider accepting, not for society's sake but for her own, and to reclaim what had been taken from her that night, to prove to herself that she could stand in those glittering rooms no longer as a victim, but as a woman who knew her worth regardless of others' judgment. Eleanor's immediate response was fear that rose sharp and familiar in her chest, the remembered sensation of hundreds of eyes watching her humiliation, and she spoke of this fear with a vulnerability that would have been impossible a year ago, explaining that she did not know if she possessed the courage to place herself once more in that world where she had been so thoroughly destroyed. And Julian listened without trying to persuade or dismiss her concerns, and then he said something that shifted everything, that perhaps the fear itself was reason enough to go, that running from what frightened us gave it permanent power over our lives, while facing it with support and preparation could transform terror into triumph. They discussed her fears during long conversations over the following weeks, as daffodils bloomed in golden profusion and the village celebrated the lengthening days, and Julian offered to escort her if she wished, to stand by her side in those ballrooms where he had once wounded her so terribly. But he emphasized that the choice was entirely hers, and that there would be no judgment from him regardless of her decision, and this freedom to choose without pressure paradoxically made the possibility seem less daunting, for she recognized that returning to London would be an act of reclamation rather than submission, a declaration that she would not allow one terrible night to define the boundaries of her entire existence. Eleanor made her decision on a morning when apple blossoms fell like snow across the orchard, and she had been teaching at the village school, watching her students tackle difficult lessons with the kind of courage that came from not yet knowing all the ways the world could wound them, and she realized that she had spent 3 years building strength and self-knowledge in this peaceful refuge, and perhaps it was time to test whether that foundation was solid enough to withstand the scrutiny of the society that had once rejected her. And she wrote to Catherine, accepting the invitation with hands that trembled only slightly, and she told Julian that evening that she would return to London, but she would do so on her own terms, as the woman she had become, rather than the frightened girl she had been. And in his eyes, she saw pride and something deeper that made her heart race with anticipation and residual fear in equal measure. The preparation for London became a careful undertaking that occupied the weeks between Eleanor's decision and the actual journey, and though her mother sent fabric swatches and fashion plates from the city, suggesting that Eleanor commission new gowns in the latest styles, Eleanor recognized that the true transformation required was not one of silk and embroidery, but of inner fortification, the rebuilding of confidence that had been shattered 3 years prior in a moment of public cruelty. And so, while she did allow the village seamstress to update several of her existing gowns with fresh trim and more fashionable sleeves, she spent far more time preparing her mind and spirit for the ordeal of re-entering a society that had witnessed her destruction and had done nothing to defend her. She walked the countryside with fierce determination, as though she could absorb strength from the enduring hills and ancient trees, and she rehearsed in her mind how she would hold herself when the whispers began, how she would meet curious or cruel gazes with the dignity of a woman who no longer required external validation to know her worth. And Julian observed these preparations from a respectful distance, offering support when asked but never presuming to guide her choices, and when the time came for their departure, he made the decision to travel separately to London, understanding that she needed to reclaim this territory on her own terms rather than arriving under his protection like some fragile creature requiring a guardian. Eleanor journeyed to London with her mother in late April, when the city was alive with the excitement of the season's beginning, and as their carriage rolled through streets she had not seen in 3 years, she felt her pulse quicken with a complicated mixture of anticipation and dread, for though she had changed profoundly in her country exile, London remained exactly as she remembered it, beautiful and brutal, glittering with possibility and sharp with judgment, a place where reputations could be built or demolished with a single well-placed word. The Pemberton Ball arrived on a warm evening when the scent of lilacs drifted through open windows, and every fashionable family in London gathered in the magnificent ballroom that Eleanor entered, with her head high and her hand steady on her mother's arm, and she felt the moment awareness of her presence rippled through the crowd, the pause in conversations, and the turning of heads that she had anticipated and armored herself against, and some faces showed genuine pleasure at her return, while others displayed the avid curiosity of those hoping to witness fresh drama. But Eleanor found that she could meet all these gazes without the crushing shame that had once driven her into hiding, for she had spent 3 years learning that her value was not determined by the opinions of people who had never truly known her. Then the atmosphere in the ballroom shifted with Julian's entrance, and Eleanor's eyes found him across the expanse of polished floor and swirling dancers, as surely as a compass finds north, and she saw in his expression both nervousness and determination, and when he began to move through the crowd toward her with slow deliberation that allowed every person present to mark his intention, she felt her heart begin to race, not with fear, but with the profound recognition that this moment represented the convergence of separate journeys toward healing. And when he stopped before her and bowed with perfect courtesy, and asked in a voice that carried just far enough for those nearby to hear whether she would honor him with a dance, Eleanor placed her hand in his and said yes, with a clarity that felt like reclamation, like the opening of a door she had thought permanently sealed. And as they moved together toward the center of the ballroom where 3 years ago he had destroyed her, she understood that she was walking not toward repetition of past pain, but toward the possibility of transformation, and that whatever happened in the next moments would be faced by a woman who had learned through suffering and solitude and gradual trust that she possessed reserves of strength she had never imagined in those innocent days, before she learned how deeply the world could wound. The waltz began with the familiar strains of music that Eleanor had not heard in 3 years, and as Julian's hand settled at her waist and her own hand rested upon his shoulder, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon them, the collective attention of London society focused on this moment of public reunion between the man who had destroyed her and the woman who had survived that destruction, and Julian guided her through the opening steps with a grace that belied the tension she could feel in his frame, and he leaned close so that his words would reach only her ears amid the music and murmurs, and he spoke of how he had imagined this moment countless times during the long months of seeking her forgiveness, how he had dreamed of holding her thus, but had never dared believe she might grant him such mercy, and his voice carried the tremor of genuine emotion as he confessed that he loved her with a depth that terrified him, that she had become the measure against which he judged all his actions, asking himself before each decision whether he was being the man worthy of Eleanor Hartley or merely the coward who had wounded her. And Eleanor's heart pounded so forcefully she thought, surely he must feel it where their hands joined, and she wanted to respond and to tell him that she too had traveled an unexpected journey from hatred through grudging respect to something that felt remarkably like love. But before she could form the words, Julian began to slow their movements, guiding them toward the center of the ballroom, where the crowd was thickest and the watching eyes most numerous, and Eleanor felt a sudden clutch of fear as memory overlaid the present moment with the ghost of that terrible night 3 years past, for it was in precisely this location that he had stopped their waltz before and spoken those cruel words that had shattered her world, and her breath caught and her steps faltered as Julian brought them to a complete stop, exactly where they had stood when he destroyed her. And for one terrible instant, Eleanor thought she might have been wrong about everything, that this entire year of careful courtship had been merely an elaborate setup for some new and more devastating humiliation. But then Julian took both her hands in his and turned to face not her but the assembled crowd, and his voice when he spoke was clear and carrying, pitched to reach every corner of the now silent ballroom, and he said that 3 years ago, in this very spot, he had committed an act of such profound cruelty that it haunted his every waking moment, that he had publicly humiliated a woman of extraordinary grace and goodness, because his own cowardice and pride had made him lash out at the very qualities that attracted him, and he declared before all these witnesses that Lady Eleanor Hartley was the finest woman he had ever known, possessed of a strength and dignity that his own actions had tested but could not break, and that he stood before them not to ask their forgiveness, for that was not theirs to grant, but to acknowledge publicly the harm he had done and the profound unworthiness he felt in her presence, and the ballroom remained frozen in shocked silence, as Eleanor felt tears begin to slip down her cheeks. But these were not the tears of humiliation she had shed in this place before. These were tears of release and healing, the salt water that washed away the last residues of shame and fear. And when Julian turned back to her with eyes that held both hope and terror, she found she could not speak past the emotion that closed her throat, but she squeezed his hands in silent answer, and around them the whispers began to rise like wind through autumn leaves, some scandalized and some moved. But Eleanor discovered in that moment of public vulnerability that she no longer cared what any of them thought, for she had reclaimed not just her place in these glittering rooms, but something far more valuable, the certainty of her own worth and the courage to believe that even the deepest wounds could heal when met with genuine remorse and patient love. The aftermath of the ball rippled through London society with the force of a stone cast into still water, and in the days that followed, Eleanor found herself the subject of intense speculation and divided opinion, for some members of the Ton viewed Julian's public apology as a scandalous display of emotion, unbecoming an Earl, while others whispered that it had been the most romantic gesture witnessed in years, and there were those who had abandoned Eleanor 3 years prior, who now sought to renew their acquaintance as though nothing had ever transpired, extending invitations and making overtures of friendship that Eleanor received with polite distance, for she had learned during her exile which relationships possessed genuine substance and which were merely the fair-weather connections of convenience, and she discovered to her own surprise that their opinions no longer held power over her sense of worth, that the approval or disapproval of people who had shown themselves lacking in loyalty could not touch the core of self-knowledge she had built during those quiet years in Derbyshire. Julian's public acknowledgement of his cruelty had shifted the narrative in ways both subtle and profound, transforming Eleanor in the eyes of society from a woman who had been justly put in her place to a woman who had been grievously wronged and who had shown remarkable grace in accepting an apology that many deemed insufficient for the offense. And while this reassessment brought a measure of social rehabilitation, it was not this external validation that mattered to Eleanor, but rather the internal realization that bloomed in her heart in the quiet moments after the ball, the recognition that she was ready to trust Julian fully, to believe not just in his remorse, but in the fundamental transformation she had witnessed over the course of their year together. The weeks that followed brought a courtship unlike any Eleanor had imagined in her girlish dreams before the world had taught her about pain and healing, for Julian courted her with a patience and attentiveness that spoke of deep respect rather than mere passion, and they walked together through Hyde Park in the soft light of May mornings when the world seemed freshly made and full of possibility. And he took her to the theatre where they sat in his box and discussed the performances with an ease that came from genuine intellectual companionship, and they spent evenings in quiet drawing rooms, engaged in conversations that ranged from poetry to philosophy to the small observations about human nature that revealed how thoroughly they had come to know one another's minds and hearts. Julian understood that true courtship required earning the trust not just of Eleanor but of her entire family, and so he called upon her mother with respectful regularity and engaged Eleanor's younger sister in conversations about her interests and hopes, and he made no presumptions about his welcome, but rather built his place in their lives through accumulated acts of consideration and genuine care. And Eleanor's mother, who had held reservations born of protective love and memory of her daughter's suffering, found herself gradually won over by the evidence of sustained change. By the way Julian looked at Eleanor with reverence rather than possession, by his willingness to accept without complaint the slower pace and greater scrutiny that his past actions had earned. Eleanor found herself reflecting often during these weeks on the nature of transformation, both Julian's and her own, for she recognized that she was not the same woman who had fled London 3 years ago in shame and devastation, that the suffering she had endured and the solitude she had embraced had forged her into someone stronger and wiser, someone capable of discernment and forgiveness without sacrificing self-respect. And she saw, too, that Julian's change was not a temporary performance designed to win her hand, but rather a fundamental reordering of his values and priorities, evidenced not just in grand gestures, but in the small daily choices he made about how to treat every person he encountered, from the highest-ranking peer to the servant who brought his tea, and she understood that they were both walking toward a future built not on the shallow foundations of initial attraction or social advantage, but on the deeper bedrock of mutual respect and hard-won understanding. And this knowledge filled her with a quiet joy that felt more substantial and enduring than any emotion she had experienced in those innocent days, before the world had taught her that love worth having must be tested and proven and chosen, with open eyes and a heart that had learned the difference between pretty words and genuine devotion. Late spring arrived with the particular softness that belongs to early June, when the English countryside seems to hold its breath between the vigor of new growth and the drowsy abundance of summer, and it was in this season of gentle transition that Julian came to Hartley Manor with a purpose that Eleanor sensed the moment she saw him standing in the garden where she had once sought refuge from her devastation, in the same garden where she had walked endless circles, trying to convince her broken heart that it might someday beat without pain. And now here stood the man who had caused that breaking, transformed by time and genuine effort into someone she had come to love with a depth that still surprised her in quiet moments. And Julian held his hat in his hands, and there was a tremor in his fingers that spoke of nervousness, despite all the challenges he had already faced in winning her trust. And he asked if she might walk with him among the roses that were just beginning to unfurl their petals in shades of cream and blush and deepest crimson. And Eleanor took his offered arm, and they moved through the garden paths in a silence that held anticipation rather than discomfort, until Julian stopped beneath an arbor heavy with climbing roses, whose perfume sweetened the air around them, and he turned to face her with an expression that combined hope and fear, and a love so evident that Eleanor felt her breath catch even before he began to speak. And his words, when they came, were not the practiced speech of a man making a grand romantic gesture, but rather the halting, honest confession of someone offering the truth of his transformed heart. And he said that he had spent 3 years learning to be worthy of her. 3 years understanding that true change required not dramatic proclamations, but the patient daily work of becoming better, and he acknowledged that he could never erase what he had done to her in that ballroom, that the memory of his cruelty would always stand as a testament to the man he had been and a reminder of the man he must never be again. And then he knelt there in the garden dirt, heedless of his fine clothes, and asked if she would consent to marry him. Not because of his title or wealth or the social advantages such a union might bring, but because he loved her with every particle of his being, and would spend the remainder of his days striving to deserve the gift of her presence in his life. And Eleanor looked down at this man who had destroyed her and then rebuilt both himself and her faith in the possibility of redemption. And she realized that her answer had been forming throughout all the months of watching him prove, through sustained action, that people could indeed transform themselves when motivated by genuine remorse and love. And she said yes, not because she had forgotten the past, but because she had seen him face it unflinchingly and choose to become someone different, someone worthy of trust and love. And the second chance that she now understood required courage from both the one who granted it and the one who received it. And Julian rose and took her hands with a gentleness that seemed to acknowledge the preciousness of what she was giving him, and they stood together beneath the roses, planning not a grand society wedding designed to impress the ton, but rather a simple ceremony focused on the only thing that truly mattered, the love that had been earned through patience and forgiveness, and the willingness of two people to believe that even the deepest wounds could heal when met with genuine devotion and the passage of time. Summer arrived at Hartley Manor with the particular radiance that belongs to late June, when the English countryside seems to glow with an almost otherworldly beauty, and it was on such a day 3 years after the humiliation that had nearly destroyed her that Eleanor stood in the small stone chapel that had witnessed generations of Hartley family occasions, preparing to bind her life to the man who had once been her greatest source of pain and had become her most profound source of joy. And the chapel was filled, not with the glittering throngs of London society, but rather with those whose presence held genuine meaning, her family and the village friends who had sustained her through the darkest period of her life. And Julian's small circle of true companions who had witnessed his transformation and supported it without judgment. And as Eleanor walked down the short aisle on her father's arm, she was acutely aware that she was not the frightened girl who had once trembled at the opinions of people who valued appearance over substance, but rather a woman who had learned through suffering and healing to know her own worth independent of external validation. And she wore a gown of simple elegance in cream silk that needed no elaborate ornamentation because she herself had become the adornment, her face radiant with a happiness that came from choosing love with open eyes and a heart that had been broken and mended stronger than before. And when she reached the altar where Julian waited, she saw in his expression a reverence that spoke of his understanding of the gift she was giving him, the trust that he had spent 3 years earning through patient action rather than empty promises. And the vicar began the ceremony with words about the sacred nature of marriage and the commitment required to build a life together. But Eleanor barely heard the traditional phrases because she was focused entirely on Julian's face and the tears that gathered in his eyes as he looked at her. And when the moment came for vows, Julian spoke not the standard words but rather a promise he had written himself, pledging to spend every remaining day of his life striving to be worthy of her faith in him and to honor her strength and gentleness, to build with her a partnership founded on mutual respect and the understanding that love worth having must be tended carefully and protected fiercely. And Eleanor's own vows acknowledged the journey they had traveled together, the pain that had been transformed into growth, the broken trust that had been rebuilt stronger through genuine effort and time, and she promised to walk beside him, not as his subordinate, but as his equal partner, in creating a life that honored both the lessons of their difficult past and the possibilities of their shared future. And when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Julian kissed her there in that simple chapel, filled with people who genuinely loved them both, Eleanor felt a completion that had nothing to do with finally achieving the married state she had once dreamed of in her innocent girlhood, and everything to do with having found a love that had been tested and proven and chosen with wisdom, rather than naivete. And the celebration that followed was warm and genuine, with no pretense or performance, just food and laughter, and the simple joy of people who cared for one another, gathering to witness the beginning of a marriage that everyone present understood had been earned rather than simply arranged. And as evening approached, and Eleanor and Julian prepared to depart for the first night of their married life, they stood for a moment, looking back at the chapel and the manor and the gardens where so much of their story had unfolded, and Julian took her hand and said softly that they would divide their time between London and the country, creating a life that drew on the best of both worlds. And Eleanor smiled and squeezed his hand, knowing that wherever they went, they would carry with them the knowledge that they had built something rare and precious, a love founded not on the shallow attractions of youth, but on the deeper bedrock of respect and genuine transformation, and the courage required to believe that even the most profound wounds could heal when met with patience and unwavering devotion. 5 years had passed since that summer wedding at Hartley Manor, 5 years that had transformed the careful hope of newlyweds into the settled contentment of a marriage that had been tested before it even began, and had therefore been built on foundations deeper than most couples ever knew. And it was on an autumn afternoon in 1826 that Eleanor stood at the window of their country estate, watching her 2 young children play in the gardens, where she had once walked alone, nursing wounds she had thought would never heal, and her daughter Catherine, who was 4 years old, with her father's dark hair and her mother's thoughtful eyes, was attempting to teach her younger brother Thomas the proper way to hold a book, even though at 2 he was far more interested in turning pages to hear the satisfying rustle than in the stories they contained. And Eleanor felt her heart expand with a happiness so profound it still surprised her in moments like these, when she paused to consider the life she had built from the ashes of her humiliation, and she heard the sound of hoofbeats and turned to see Julian riding up the lane from the village where he had spent the afternoon, helping to repair the school roof, because despite his title and wealth, he had never forgotten the lessons he learned during those 3 years of proving himself worthy. And he dismounted and immediately scooped up both children, who shrieked with delight at their father's arrival, and Eleanor walked out to greet them, and Julian looked at her over the children's heads with an expression that still held wonder, as though he could not quite believe his good fortune in being granted this second chance at happiness. And later, after the children had been fed and bathed and tucked into their beds with stories and kisses, Eleanor and Julian sat together in the library, where a fire crackled against the autumn chill, and they spoke, as they often did, of the ordinary concerns of their shared life, estate matters, and the children's education and plans for the winter months. But then Julian grew quiet and reached for Eleanor's hand and said that he had been thinking about that night at the Ashworth ball and how it had been 8 years since he had destroyed her with his cruelty, and Eleanor felt the old pain stir briefly, like an almost healed wound touched gently. But when she looked at Julian, she saw not the arrogant Earl who had humiliated her, but rather the man who had spent years learning to be better and who still worked every day to deserve the gift of her love. And she told him that she had been thinking of it too, but not with anguish anymore, rather with a kind of grateful recognition that sometimes the worst moments of our lives become the catalysts for the most profound transformations. And Julian's eyes grew bright with unshed tears as he said that he would never stop being sorry for causing her pain, but that he was also grateful in a way he could barely articulate, because that terrible night had forced him to confront the man he had been and choose to become someone different. And Eleanor squeezed his hand and said that their story had become proof to her that people truly could change when motivated by genuine remorse and love, and that wounds could heal when met with patience and sustained devotion. And they sat together in comfortable silence as the fire burned low and the house settled into evening quiet around them. And through the window Eleanor could see the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that had looked down on her during those terrible months after her humiliation, when she had believed her life was effectively over. And she marveled at how impossible it would have seemed then to imagine this moment of peaceful domestic happiness, this life built with the very man who had broken her, and she understood with complete clarity that their love was stronger precisely because it had been earned rather than easily given, tested rather than assumed, chosen daily rather than taken for granted. And as Julian kissed her good night and they prepared to retire, She felt a completeness that had nothing to do with fairy tale endings and everything to do with the quiet satisfaction of a life lived with intention and the courage to believe in transformation, even when the evidence against it seemed overwhelming. Dear listener, as we close the pages of Eleanor and Julian's story, we must pause to consider what their journey reveals about the nature of transformation and forgiveness, and the extraordinary courage required to believe that people can change even when they have wounded us most deeply. For this is not merely a tale of romance restored, but rather a profound meditation on what it truly means to earn redemption through sustained action rather than empty promises. And perhaps you who are listening have yourself experienced wounds that seemed impossible to heal, or have been the one who inflicted pain and now seeks to make amends. And if so, then let Eleanor and Julian's story serve as testament to the truth that transformation requires not grand gestures made in moments of passion, but rather the patient accumulation of small choices made consistently over time, the willingness to remain present even when immediately forgiven seems impossible, the humility to accept that some wounds take years to heal and that this timeline must be respected rather than rushed, and understand, too, that forgiveness is not weakness, but perhaps the greatest strength we possess as human beings, the ability to look clearly at the damage done to us and choose nevertheless to believe in the possibility of change, though this forgiveness must never be confused with foolishness. For Eleanor did not forgive Julian because of pretty words or momentary remorse, but rather because she witnessed 3 years of genuine transformation, saw him become through deliberate effort a man worthy of the trust she had every right to withhold. And this distinction matters profoundly because second chances must be earned through action rather than demanded through expectation, and the love that Eleanor and Julian built together was stronger precisely because it had been tested before it even began, founded not on the shallow attractions of physical beauty or social position, but on the deeper bedrock of mutual respect and the shared understanding that they had both been transformed by their journey through pain toward healing. And perhaps you face tonight a wound that seems too deep to mend or stand on the other side, hoping desperately to prove yourself changed to someone you have hurt. And if so, then let this story remind you that healing is possible but never easy, that it requires time and patience, and the willingness to believe that we are not forever defined by our worst moments, but can, through genuine effort, become better than we have been. And may you find the courage, whether you are the wounded or the one who has wounded, to engage in the difficult work of transformation and forgiveness, to trust that even the most profound breaks can be mended when met with sustained devotion and authentic change. And may you rest tonight in the knowledge that your story, like Eleanor and Julian's, is still being written, and that the possibility of redemption and healing remains available to all who are willing to pursue it with honest hearts and patient hands. And if this story has moved you, then please subscribe to Enchanted Chronicles, where we share tales of love and transformation and the enduring human capacity for growth. And may you find peace in whatever storms you weather and courage for whatever journeys lie ahead. For the stars that shine above us tonight are the same stars that witnessed Eleanor's tears and her eventual joy, eternal witnesses to the truth that even our darkest nights can give way to unexpected dawn.